The SR-71 Blackbird is one aircraft that really needs no introduction. This high-flying spy plane is known the world over for its ability to scream across the sky at better than Mach 3, flying with what seemed like impunity over the most contested regions of the globe. And the truth is, the Habu, as its pilots knew it, really was the engineering marvel that it's so often made out to be. Not just achieving Mach 3 plus speeds like other aircraft have before or since, but sustaining them for hours on end, managing temperatures so high that the cockpit canopy glass couldn't be glass at all and was instead made of a fused silica quartz. This piece of sci-fi engineering was the product of Lockheed visionary Kelly Johnson, and an American defense budget that was between 2 and 3 times larger than today's, at least in terms of the share of the American GDP that it soaked up. Its combination of high altitude, Mach 3 plus speed, reduced radar cross-section, and highly classified electronic warfare capabilities made it a seemingly impossible target, outrunning an alleged 4,000 surface-to-air missiles launched at it throughout its high-flying career, and ultimately retiring without a single aircraft ever lost to enemy fire. But as we've discussed on this channel lots of times before, the internet has a bad habit of boiling away the nuance in conversations about, well, pretty much everything. And the SR-71 is no exception. Today, we see the SR-71 through a lens of its history-making successes, and justifiably so, but it's just as important that we remember, that we understand that those successes were not the whole story. Because anytime you push the limits of technology, you introduce risk. And few pilots in history were more aware of that fundamental truth than America's elite fraternity of Habu drivers. Because when you're scorching the atmosphere under full afterburner more than 16 miles up, it isn't the enemy that'll get you. It's the aircraft itself. And nearly 40% of all SR-71s ever built would ultimately go down in flames. Not, again, because of enemy action, but because defying physics is always a dangerous game, even for aviation legends like Kelly Johnson. So let's talk about just how dangerous it was to fly at the top of the world in the SR-71 Blackbird. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. We've talked about recency bias on this channel a bunch of times over the years, usually when discussing the F-35 program and its highly publicized developmental struggles. The F-35 has the unique distinction of being the highest profile fighter program of the modern era, emerging on the world stage within literally just months of YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook all opening their digital doors to the masses, introducing a fundamental shift in the way information is shared among the world's population of big-brained monkeys like you and me, and ushering in the modern attention-based media model. Or to put it another way, the F-35 is the first social media fighter, a program that's seen more discussion, more press coverage, more misinformation, more disinformation, more marketing, more corporate propaganda, more discourse, and more analysis than any fighter program that ever came before. And as the editor of a news outlet and a longtime journalist myself, I can personally attest to the fact that articles with headlines about problems with the F-35 always perform better than articles about its capabilities. Though, to be fair, that's not exactly unique to the F-35. One 2023 study published in the Nature of Human Behavior journal found that the presence of negative words in a headline alone results in a substantial increase in average clicks on a story. And another Stanford study published in 2024 found that negative headlines and news stories substantially increased their chances at social media virality, further incentivizing news outlets to find the bad angles of any topic they cover for the sake of driving advertising dollars. And It makes sense that stories about F-35 crashes would be big news. They are expensive, fancy new fighters, after all. Then likewise, with billions spent on the fighter's development, setbacks and delays are absolutely worthy of discussion. But we are, again, big-brained monkeys, evolutionarily tuned to identify patterns in the world around us and to trust our inherent ability to do so, because that could mean the difference between a successful hunt or going hungry, or the difference between spotting a threat while there's still time to escape, or not escaping at all. But our billions of years of evolution now have to contend with a digital onslaught of online content, a task that we are poorly suited for. So, when we see 3 articles about F-35 crashes over the span of a year without seeing much about any other fighters going down, well, our big monkey brains identify that pattern and we form the conclusion that F-35s must crash a lot. Of course, in reality, F-35s see fewer crashes per 100,000 flight hours than any other fighter in American service. And objectively speaking, the F-35 has proven to be among the safest tactical aircraft of the modern era. That pattern our brains picked up on isn't reflective of reality, it's reflective of exposure, what we're exposed to. And with more than 1,200 F-35s flying around out there and F-35 mishaps making for great headlines, it's easy to see how modern media practices can create those patterns for us. And this, in a strange way, also retroactively shapes our perceptions of previous high-profile programs as well. We think back to the aircraft we had in posters on our walls as kids, and don't remember there being hordes of haters dedicated to calling them junk under every tweet because, well, tweets didn't exist. We don't recall these programs suffering big budget setbacks or scandals, not because they didn't, but because the discourse about those controversies was largely relegated to the pages of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, rather than delivered straight to your Facebook newsfeed as you numbly scroll in bed. That is to say that no game-changing capability has ever come easy, but we tend to assume that our problems, or the problems of our generation, are unique and special because, well, they're ours, and to our recollection, they really are. But if you look back through the objective lens of history at the programs that we see today as incredible successes, what we'll find, more often than not, is a mess of problems, setbacks, catastrophes, long nights, bad days, and even a bit of tragedy. And with that added context, we can come to understand that at the time, the success of these programs was never a sure thing. They had critics, maybe even haters. They had real problems and were rife with real risk. In the years since, those problems and even those critics simply faded away into obscurity as the legend of the SR-71 outlived them both. And in cases like the Blackbird, the added context of its setbacks and shortcomings doesn't make the aircraft any less special. It makes the incredible success of this aircraft all the more impressive, while highlighting the incredible skill, professionalism, and bravery Habu crews demonstrated on a daily basis. Because there was never a guarantee that Kelly Johnson's crazy spy plane would work. But somehow, Lockheed, the CIA, and the Air Force made it happen. Or, as Kelly Johnson himself put it in his book, Kelly, More Than My Share of It All, quote, "The idea of attaining and staying at Mach 3.2 over long flights was the toughest job the Skunk Works ever had, and the most difficult of my career. Early in the development stage, I promised $50 to anyone who could find anything easy to do. I might as well have offered $1,000 because I still have the money." Now, for the record, $50 back in 1964 was the equivalent of more than $520 today, and that isn't a bad bonus for anyone who managed to just find a simple task. And while today we see that incredible difficulty as little more than a plot point in the story of Kelly Johnson and Lockheed's ultimate success, those challenges were decidedly more real for the men tasked with building and flying these jets. Out of the 32 SR-71 Blackbirds Lockheed built for the Air Force, which includes 29 SR-71As, 2 twin-cockpit SR-71Bs, and a single unique SR-71C built out of the remains of a crashed SR-71A, combined with the remains of a crashed YF-12. A whopping 12 of those 32 aircraft were ultimately lost in accidents. Now that means that while no adversary ever managed to shoot one down, nearly 38% of all Blackbirds ever built would ultimately go down anyway. Now, to swing that back around to my F-35 comparison from earlier, which I absolutely acknowledge does not push the limits of aviation performance in the ways the Blackbird did, a 38% loss rate at this point in production would equate to more than 450 F-35s going down in non-combat crashes. And while the F-35 doesn't fly anywhere near Mach 3, it is worth noting that it does come with several notable firsts of its own, including being the first operational fighter, not stealth fighter, but fighter in general, ever to fly supersonic and then land vertically, and being the first stealth fighter ever to operate off of aircraft carriers. These are not advancements that come without risk, even if the risk isn't as pronounced as those faced by Blackbird crews. Now, the first Blackbird to go down actually came the very month the aircraft entered service, on January 25th of 1966. SR-71 test pilot Bill Weaver and Lockheed systems specialist Jim Swire were tasked with testing a flight configuration that had the potential to reduce trim drag and thus improve the aircraft's high Mach performance, which in part involved moving the aircraft's center of gravity further back in the aircraft. Now that, unfortunately, did not have the intended effect. And I'll quote Bill Weaver directly from his write-up on chuckyeager.org. Quote, "On the planned test profile, we entered a programmed 35-degree bank turn to the right. An immediate unstart occurred in the right engine, forcing the aircraft to roll further right and start to pitch up. I jammed the control stick as far left and forward as it would go. No response. I instantly knew that we were in for a wild ride. I attempted to tell Jim what was happening and to stay with the airplane until we reached a lower speed and altitude. I didn't think the chances of surviving an ejection at Mach 3.18 at 78,800 feet were very good. However, G-forces built up so rapidly that my words came out garbled and unintelligible, as confirmed later by the cockpit voice recorder. Everything seemed to unfold in slow motion. I learned later the time from the event onset to catastrophic departure from controlled flight was only 2 to 3 seconds. Still, trying to communicate with Jim, I blacked out, succumbing to extremely high G-forces. The SR-71 then literally disintegrated around us. From that point, I was just along for the ride. Now, Weaver would regain consciousness a short time later, still strapped to his unfired ejection seat as it fell from just shy of 15 miles up. As he said, the aircraft had come apart around him, and fortunately, the emergency oxygen cylinder in his seat was functioning properly, pressurizing his suit to keep his blood from boiling, giving him air to breathe, and as an added benefit, the inflated suit also helped to prevent him from suffering more serious injuries. He had departed from Edwards Air Force Base in California and ultimately landed in a cattle ranch in northeastern New Mexico. Unfortunately, Swire was killed as the aircraft came apart, but incredibly, he'd be the only SR-71 crew member to be lost in such an accident. Now, just 1 year later, the first production Blackbird would also be lost during landing while testing a new anti-skid braking system. As Lockheed test pilot Art Peterson, flying solo for this test, came down on the wet runway, his drag chute failed to deploy properly, and when his wheels hit a patch of dry runway, they immediately blew out from the high speed, dropping down onto the magnesium wheel hubs that soon ignited due to all the friction and heat. Peterson managed to keep the aircraft mostly under control as it careened off the runway and into a nearby lake bed. He managed to scramble out of the cockpit as the entire aircraft was engulfed in flames. And just 3 months later, another Blackbird would go down about 15 miles north of Las Vegas. This time, Air Force Captain Earl Lee Boone, the pilot, and Captain Richard Butch Sheffield, the reconnaissance systems officer, were climbing after taking on fuel when the aircraft unintentionally decelerated to below 0.9 Mach while they were flying at a high altitude. The combination of the aircraft's fully fueled weight, its low airspeed, and the high angle of attack they were at led to an accelerated stall and then post-stall gyrations that tore the aircraft apart. This time, both the pilot and RSO managed to punch out in time, but as the aircraft disintegrated, fuel sprayed all around them. Sheffield's ejection seat rocket ignited the fuel mist, and that forced Boone to eject straight through the fireball. Somehow, both men survived with relatively minor injuries, and just 6 months after that, another Blackbird would go down over Nevada when the aircraft's inertial navigation system and primary attitude indicator both failed, and the jet's pilot, Air Force Major Roy St. Martin, didn't realize the aircraft had gone nose down into a steep descent from around 78,000 feet to below 60,000. When he realized it and attempted to recover, the SR-71 rolled inverted, and after attempting to regain control for another 20,000 feet, both he and his RSO, Captain John Carnican, punched out. With the aircraft plummeting at more than 3,000 feet per second, they cleared the jet within less than 20 seconds of it hitting the ground. 3 months after that, in January of 1968, the first SR-71B trainer aircraft with 2 cockpits would go down. This time, due to a catastrophic electrical failure followed by 2 engine flameouts. The pilot and RSO ejected at just 3,000 feet off the ground and only a few miles short of their intended runway at Beale Air Force Base. 10 months later, a rear tire blew out on an SR-71 during a high-speed takeoff, and that tire struck a wing fuel cell which began pouring fuel onto the runway that was then ignited by the jet's afterburner. The RSO ejected as the aircraft tore down the runway with no brakes and a glowing fire behind it, but its pilot, Major Gabriel Cardong, rode the jet all the way to a stop before climbing out amid the flames. 6 months later, another takeoff mishap led to yet another Blackbird going down in flames. 8 months after that, an unknown explosion at the rear of another Blackbird flying over California, likely due to an issue with an afterburner, forced another crew ejection and total airframe loss. 6 months later, a Blackbird suffered flameouts in both engines as its crew tried to climb over a thunderstorm. When they were unable to restart the engines or regain control of the aircraft, the pilot and RSO bailed out, leaving that SR-71 to crash into the Japanese jungle below. 6 months later, turbulence during refueling caused a Blackbird to collide with a KC-135 that it was refueling from, destroying the front of the aircraft and forcing the crew to eject, though the damaged KC-135 was able to land. This list goes on. Of course, after every incident, Lockheed's team set about making changes to the aircraft to prevent the same sort of accidents from happening again. And that is the nature of pushing the limits of technology. To some extent, the work does become something of a guess-and-check enterprise. And there were plenty of other close calls caused by technical issues that suddenly popped up while flying over adversary nations or screaming across the stratosphere at more than 2,000 miles per hour. I'll quote former SR-71 Reconnaissance System Officer, or RSO, Butch Sheffield, who you may recall from one of those ejection stories. Quote, "After turning, we headed toward Japan. During that big turn, the oil pressure on the left engine began falling and rapidly dropped to 0. We stayed on a southeastern heading but shut down that engine and flew on one engine against awful headwinds at 15,000 feet as we approached the North Korean coastline. We were just struggling to maintain altitude and didn't realize until later that the North Koreans had scrambled fighters against us and the South Koreans had scrambled their fighters to get between us and the North Koreans to defend us. We had no choice but to put into a South Korean airbase in Daegu. I called the field, but they refused permission to land. Field closed, they said. I said, I've got to land. Turn on your lights. We came in and just sat there, surrounded by dozens of people in black pajamas with machine guns. My pilot said to me, Butch, you sure we landed in South Korea? That was one of 2 emergency landings that Butch would see in South Korea that year. Years later, in 1982, Blackbird pilot Lieutenant Colonel William Burke Jr. would have his own tech issues that involved managing relations with foreign states. I'll quote him now. "We completed our pass over Beirut and turned toward Malta when I got a warning low oil pressure light on my right engine. Even though the engine was running fine, I slowed down and lowered our altitude and made a direct line for England. We decided to cross France without clearance instead of going the roundabout way. We made it almost across when I looked out my left window and saw a French Mirage 3 sitting 10 feet off my left wing. He came up on our frequency and asked us for our diplomatic clearance number. I had no idea what he was talking about, so I told him to stand by. I asked my backseater, who said, 'Don't worry about it.' I just gave it to him. What he had given him was the bird with his middle finger. I lit the afterburners and left the Mirage standing still. 2 minutes later, we were crossing the channel." Now, I want to be clear that the SR-71 Blackbird was, objectively speaking, one of the most successful and groundbreaking pieces of engineering to emerge in the 20th century, and maybe even of all time. And today, we rightly remember it as such. But our memified perceptions of this program and of the aircraft it produced, and of the men who built it, and of the men who flew it, robs the romance from its story. And in terms of analytical value, it prevents us from accurately assessing the setbacks faced by more modern programs. That is to say, that we tend to view history through rose-colored glasses, and that can skew our understanding of not just history, but of the present as well. It's important that we recognize that pushing the limits of aviation has never been easy, and that setbacks, delays, even tragedies are more often than not par for the course, when the goal is to do something that didn't seem possible just a few years before. That is the nature of military aviation. That's the risk pilots embrace as they strap on their gear. That's the reality being faced by today's engineers, just as it was 60 years ago at the Skunk Works. And when you remember that, it not only helps contextualize today's challenges, but it helps to humanize yesterday's victories. And if you ask me, those are both worthwhile endeavors. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and please click subscribe. I'm really trying to hit 500,000 subscribers by the end of September, and if you guys could help, that would mean a ton. And don't forget to leave me a comment while you're down there so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.